Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. North Korea criticized the U.S. for agreeing to terminate all the missile guidelines for South Korea, although the criticism was made under the name of an international affairs critic rather than of a government official. Meanwhile, Stephen Biegun, who was the top negotiator on North Korea for the previous Trump administration, said North Korea was not serious in discussing denuclearization during the talks. Amid all these, how will the Biden administration be working with South Korea toward denuclearizing North Korea? Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Bruce Bennett, a senior international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Bennett is an expert in Northeast Asian military issues and has worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Pacific Command, and Central Command. Michael O'Hanlon also joins me today. Mr. O'Hanlon is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, specializing in the U.S. defense strategy and national security policy. He authored numerous books, including Crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start with the North Korean reaction to the U.S.-South Korea agreement to terminate the missile guidelines. Was the reaction different in a sense that North Korea used the name of a so-called international affairs critic to criticize the U.S. for lifting all restrictions on South Korean missiles? Dr. Bennett.
Well, I think you have to recognize that North Korea knows that Americans tend to mirror image our culture. And so we seem to think that if it's not the government, but it's a critic, that's a difference. And so they're trying to impress us that it's not really the government complaining. But in North Korea, is there really an independent critic? Is there someone who takes action without approval of Kim Jong-un and the regime itself? Not going to happen. So this was something they did for optics, for our reaction. They're anxious to get us to continue our strategic patience. I mean, the reality is, the end of the Trump administration, the U.S. basically practiced strategic patience. Now we still are. I mean, there are some things we're doing different, but largely it's strategic patience. That's what they want. It allows them to continue building their nuclear forces. And so they want us to feel like we're secure. They wanted to make the criticism, but for us not to react too seriously.
Mr. O'Hanlon, there were some people who view the criticism from North Korea was rather restrained. Do you agree to that?
Greetings. Well, I agree with that point, yes, and with almost everything Dr. Bennett said. A very good analysis on his part. But I do think that this is just a first step. It's basically a shot across the bow to the Biden administration to say, we're not very happy about the start that you're off to, this whole strategic review, the step-by-step approach, the permission to the ROK to develop longer-range missiles. We're going to mildly object, but you should be aware that we can object more strongly down the road. So we don't want to poison the relationship completely. This is in contrast at about this time in 2009, as you'll recall, North Korea greeted President Obama with a nuclear weapons test. In this case, the objection is more mild. And the only point where I would differ slightly from Dr. Bennett, and maybe we can explore this further, I'm not so sure that North Korea is happy about the way things are right now. I agree they want to have the flexibility to keep building more nuclear weapons, but their economy has probably deteriorated by about 20% over the course of the last 3 years. First from the UN sanctions that followed their nuclear and missile tests of 2017, and then from COVID. And I think they need economic relief badly, just as Kim Jong-un said to President Trump in the second of 3 summits, the Hanoi summit.
Mm-hmm. About the missile guidelines that North Koreans criticized, Dr. Bennett, how significant is this militarily for North Korean regime?
Well, you have to recognize that before the guidelines were terminated, South Korea had the ability to build an 800-kilometer range missile with any payload they wanted to put on it. That was where we were before the summit meeting. With 800-kilometer range, you can be in most of South Korea and hit anywhere in North Korea. So this really wasn't about changing the South Korean ability to pressure North Korea. it really was, in many ways, an ability for President Biden to get South Korea to say, we're going to do something about China. Because the longer range missiles really are more about China than they are about North Korea. South Korea for 10 years has been building a 1,500 kilometer range cruise missile. They weren't following the missile guidelines on cruise missiles. That was not needed to target anything in North Korea. It gave them the ability to deal with China. Now they are apparently going to be building ballistic missiles to do it. So relaxing the guidelines, good for South Korea. President Moon wanted that because it established their independence. But in addition, it gives them some leverage to break the Chinese dominance of the peninsula, which China very much wants to have, and certainly tried to exercise with THAAD and with COVID and so forth. So I think the U.S. is very pleased that South Korea is going to have this somewhat greater leverage. It's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Mr. O'Hanlon, what is your view on this? The relaxing the missile guidelines, is it a more threat to China than North Korea?
Yeah, Dr. Bennett makes a fascinating argument, and it's pretty compelling. I think, though, that for me, the other part of it, which he also noted, but I would reinforce, is the sovereignty issue. I sort of feel like it's time to stop having the United States get a veto over South Korean military decisions on force modernization, with the exception that I hope South Korea will not build its own nuclear weapons. And I think our interest in global nonproliferation is strong enough that I would strongly prefer that South Korea not take that step. But on any kind of conventional force planning, while it's good to do things through the alliance framework because we want to be efficient and we want to coordinate, I don't like this idea of the United States sort of being in the father role of getting to say no and almost exercising discipline. The ROK is one of the most impressive countries on earth by almost any metric. And I think we should view the ROK as just as much a peer ally as we do any of our European allies or Japan. And so I'm just on the sovereignty issue alone. I don't want to sound like I'm becoming a South Korean nationalist, but if I were South Korean, I would be offended that the United States still thinks it has a right to approve my decisions on these kinds of things. And I think we have to understand the United States that South Koreans are proud and they value their sovereignty. And if we want to have a strong long-term relationship, the alliance has to be equal in as many ways as possible. Now, one quick point, I don't, however, favor operational control transition, because I think that the United States is far and away the stronger military of the two, just by virtue of size and global reach. So the sovereignty argument does not lead me to support OPCON transfer or OPCON transition. But I do think that South Korea should be allowed to buy whatever weapons it wants.
Mm-hmm. In the following event, South Korea decided to participate in the U.S.-led multinational Air Force drill, Red Flag Alaska 21-2 exercise, and North Korea slammed South Korea's decision. Mr. O'Hanlon, why is North Korea feel threatened by this?
Yeah, North Korea's got to be careful here, because we have tried to be somewhat accommodating in listening to their objections to large-scale military exercises on the peninsula, because those are the ones that, if you put on a worst-case military planning hat, could look like the preparation for an offensive attack. They are not preparation for an offensive attack. They are motivated strictly by defensive purposes. But we have gone out of our way in the last few years to listen to the North Korean objections and to try to scale back the magnitude of those exercises, maybe increase the frequency, reduce the size. And I'm okay with that personally, because I think we can train pretty well at the level of the brigade, an air squadron, or an air wing. I'm not convinced we need to do the huge exercises, but we've been accommodating towards North Korea. By contrast, an exercise that happens in Alaska or the United States, mainland, contiguous 48, wherever, this is not in any way, shape, or form to be confused with a possible preparation for an offensive operation. And North Korea has to understand that as long as it devotes 20% of its GDP to its military and bases 70% of its conventional forces near the DMZ and keeps building 5 to 10 nuclear weapons a year and points all of this in the direction of South Korea, we have a right and an obligation as an alliance to be prepared for the worst. So this North Korean objection, to me, holds no water.
Well, I think we also have to recognize that doing an exercise in Alaska is not under the responsibility of the U.S. Forces Korea Commander, the CFC commander. This is under the U.S. Indo-Pacific commander. This is part of South Korea's responsibility under the Mutual Defense Treaty. When you go to Alaska, you're not planning to exercise how you defend Korea. You're planning on how you're exercising on how you're going to defend the United States. And South Korea has a responsibility under the treaty to do that and to cooperate with procedures for preparing for the defense of the United States. That is something which is important for everybody, US and Koreans, to understand. And so North Korea doesn't really fully understand on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's important to note North Korea will criticize South Korea and the United States anytime they get a chance to.
Meanwhile, Stephen Biegun, former Deputy Secretary of State and former U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, had an interview with Arms Control Association discussing a wide range of issues on North Korea for the first time since his term ended in January earlier this year. In his interview, he indicated that North Korean regime was never really ready to discuss the denuclearization. Dr. Bennett, then what should be at the core of the Biden administration strategy in denuclearizing North Korea?
Well, I think the key here is Kim Jong-un doesn't have a lot of reason for denuclearizing at the current point in time. I mean, I think Michael is right. North Korea needs to get sanctions relief, but he's not shown any serious interest in doing that. I think our focus has got to shift in the direction President Biden has been talking about when he talks about stern deterrence. You know, North Korea has built, according to Sig Hecker, probably the U.S. expert, built 30 to 60, maybe more nuclear weapons. That's enough to cause serious damage to South Korea. What has the U.S. and South Korea done to protect ourselves against those weapons? Where are the shelters at Camp Humphreys, the big base we've been building? Are there nuclear shelters there, really? How protected are we at all of our bases in South Korea? Because nuclear weapons could significantly change our military capabilities. We need to build a deterrent so that then, much as President Park Geun-hye said years ago, she said, we have to strengthen ourselves to the point where North Korea concludes that building more nuclear weapons doesn't give them more power. And that's when I think we will get leverage over them in negotiating.
Mr. O'Hanlon?
I agree with the strengthening of the defenses and the stern deterrence concept that Dr. Bennett has put forth and that the Biden administration has also espoused. But my own view on a denuclearization strategy has another element as well. And I try to lay this out in my newest book, The Art of War in an Age of Peace, where I have a chapter on Korea. And I think we need to envision an interim deal that would essentially cap the North Korean nuclear arsenal where it is. Not because we do arms control and allow them to have a certain number of weapons, not because we recognize them as a nuclear weapons state. I do not favor doing that. But I believe we should try to verifiably dismantle their production capability in exchange for a lifting of the UN sanctions. We keep the US sanctions, we keep other sanctions, we prohibit World Bank loans, and otherwise keep leverage to someday aspire to denuclearization, the elimination of the existing arsenal. But I don't think that's a realistic first step. Kim Jong-un saw what happened to Saddam Hussein when Saddam did not have nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi when Gaddafi did not have nuclear weapons. He is not going to do the same thing. He also inherited a nuclear weapons arsenal from his father and grandfather that in many ways is sort of the crown jewel of the family dynasty and of the DPRK. So again, for multiple reasons, the idea of complete elimination of this arsenal, I think, is a pipe dream. It's a fairy tale. It's just not a serious basis for American diplomatic strategy. And I worry that we get caught up in thinking that it still could be. I thought President Trump might actually figure out the art of the deal with the North Koreans, which is to do something like what I said. And I wish he had, because as a Republican, he probably could have pulled it off much more easily than Joe Biden. If Biden were to do a deal that laid out roughly what I propose, partial lifting of sanctions in exchange for a verifiable dismantlement of production capability and a permanent test moratorium as well, or permanent test ban. Those things, I think, would be very effective, a reasonable first step, but they would be heavily criticized by Republican Congress and future presidential candidate as somehow appeasing North Korea or allowing it to have a nuclear arsenal, where I think it's just recognizing that the first step cannot be complete denuclearization.
Dr. Bennett, do you want to say anything to this?
Well, I think Michael has exactly the right kind of idea. My sense is as well, we've got to go after production. I take a little different view, though, of the Hanoi summit. When I look at the Hanoi summit, I remember that President Trump said that Kim Jong-un offered the uranium enrichment facility at Yongbyon and wanted major sanctions relief. The problem in my mind is the uranium enrichment facility at Yongbyon may only be 20 or 25% of North Korean uranium enrichment capability. And so if that's all we were going to get, that isn't enough. President Trump said at the press conference after Hanoi, he said, I asked him for another facility that I thought was important, and he said, no way. Well, that's because there are other facilities that need to be included in the concept Michael is talking about, that concept of a total production freeze. And we shouldn't be giving 80% of sanctions relief to Kim Jong-un for 20% of production capacity reduction. We've got to have a balanced agreement, or even more, there will be Democrats and Republicans in the United States who would criticize a president who did that.
I agree very much. That was very well laid out, just to be clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a little bit different topic. Secretary Blinken encouraged NATO to deepen its cooperation with Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. Mr. O'Hanlon, why did he mention South Korea here?
Well, this gets, I think, to, again, some of what Dr. Bennett and you were talking about earlier with the Indo-Pacific Command framework for the alliance and the mutuality, that the United States, of course, is interested in creating various ways to monitor and even push back against China's rise, as well as to just create a stronger network of alliances and partnerships throughout the broader Indo-Pacific region for whatever reason, whatever crisis, whatever kind of problem, even humanitarian disaster or emergency relief of one kind or another. And South Korea, of course, is one of our most important and powerful allies. It, to my mind, has one of the 5 or 6 best militaries on Earth, and probably at least as capable as a number of members of the Quad. And so it makes sense to see if we could do more with South Korea. On the other hand, we also know that pushing South Korea too hard might be a mistake, because South Korea has a different relationship with China than any of the other countries that you just mentioned, different geographical proximity, and greater sensitivity to trying to avoid tense and tough relations with China. Now, at the same time, it's doing things like building military capability that could constitute a bit of a deterrent against China. It's not afraid to push back against China on certain issues, but it also is very careful about adjusting the rheostat just so, such that it does not unnecessarily inflame relations with China. And for example, Japan, which is often, depending on leader, staunchly critical of China. Again, China and Japan have a complex relationship, and sometimes they get along better than others. But still, the Quad may or may not be the comfortable place for South Korea to sit and to align itself. So we may want to do this a la carte, issue by issue, rather than trying to push too hard for South Korea to be a part of some kind of a formal coalition or an increasingly formal coalition.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bennett, this is related to something Mr. O'Hanlon just mentioned. Congressional Research Service recently released a report saying South Korea's participation in Quad may be more likely if the Biden administration drops the U.S. framing of the anti-China. Do you agree with this view?
Well, it is possible that that's the case, but the issue here is China does not want a closer US-ROC alliance. North Korea really doesn't want a closer alliance. China's got leverage on South Korea. The leverage China has, it's built over what I would call several decade Cold War with South Korea. They've built up trade because China believes that economic relationships give it an ability to influence or dominate other countries. They're doing it with Belt and Road Initiative. They're doing it with trade with other partners. And that is how they have been leveraging South Korea, both on THAAD, didn't work, but they tried. Then on COVID, and it did work, and South Korea refused to close the border with China. China's got some real leverage there, and we have to recognize that South Korea's got to be very careful about that. Nevertheless, I think South Korea is going to be very careful with regard to Quad because of that relationship. It's going to take South Korea some time, and we ought to focus on North Korea in our alliance relationship and gradually build from that basis.
I really appreciate that we got to cover these important issues with you two. I hope we get to go deeper in these issues again in the near future. Dr. Bennett and Mr. O'Hanlon, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman visited Southeast Asia, emphasizing the U.S. presence in the Indo-Pacific region. During her visit, Sherman said the recent appointment of Sung Kim as Special Envoy for North Korea is a signal that the Biden administration is ready for dialogue, urging Pyongyang to accept the possibility. And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.